The Giant Killers, Chapter 5.
7 years had passed since Theb ported me away from Bishop's Gate to the safety of the mountain elf keep called Cule Tavet. This small yet formidable stronghold was a gift, built by the dwarves of the north as payment and in gratitude for their emancipation. Freedom gained after nearly 200 years of slavery at the hands of the giants. The mountain elves succeeded in stealing away many of the dwarves from the giants' forge, all while being pushed away themselves by the unrelenting expansion of mankind. The Grey Elves asked not for riches, only a place to remain unseen. Cule Tavet would be hard to find, even if you knew exactly where it was. The daylight reflected off the broad river valley, illuminating the haze and fog from a nearby waterfall for most of the days. This caused a shroud of mist and a nearly constant haze around the entrance. The keep's passages and spires were built into the very rock of the mountainside, its visage obstructed by trees and the magical refraction of the lake light. The keep was essentially built to be invisible to mankind. There were no roads there. Like any other elven home, the Grey Mountain Elves kept Cule Tavet's location an existential secret. They were not happy that Theb brought me there, but honoring tradition meant tolerating my presence during my time of fertile rest. At first they agreed because of Theb, one of their own sons, who had pleaded for them to do so. Later, because of another traveler that arrived there, one who was also known to them, but not to me. She also wanted for me to be protected, but for very different reasons. Soon after I was revived, eating, sleeping, and walking normally again, I became more cognizant of my surroundings. It didn't take long for me to realize I was being held in place. All of my actions were being watched very closely. I was told by my handlers that Theb had been gone for several weeks now. The note he left behind for me said he was tracking down the whereabouts of our enemies in anticipation of my recovery from the long sleep. But now that I was awake and recovering, Theb was still away. I had no way of contacting him, as I was essentially a prisoner locked inside my quarters within Cule Tavet. The mountain elves were very courteous and offered me books from their ancient library to learn about my heritage. I took the books, though my thoughts were only of how I was going to escape this place and reclaim whatever was left of my guild and its treasure. The guild hall and the vault, I was certain were compromised, but I had rat drops of coin and valuable artifacts all over, from the Ostrom to the borderlands, that would enable me to re-establish somewhere. It was certainly more than enough to bail my way out of here, if I was a prisoner, as it now seemed I was. The friendly Grey Elves served me, but no one would speak to me, and the armed guards outside my door were there to ensure that I could not leave my quarters. I ate and drank a lot, regaining weight and losing track of time. Then she arrived. I was awakened early one morning by the large wooden double doors being thrown open by the ever-present guards. An elvish woman entered behind them. She was young and beautiful. She wore druidic garb, including a half-moon bone carving on her head. The sullen expression on her copper-toned face gave away her obvious feelings of disappointment. She could barely bring herself to look at me. I knew immediately what this was about. She spoke to me in the same elvish tongue of my father, Pule.
My name is Nuna. I am cousin to Tara Kalin, the druid queen. who was to be your mother, before she was poisoned and then drained of her blood by the mares of Doiki,"
she said with palpable disdain, whispering a prayer to herself and her gods in predicate. She looked at me only briefly in quick glances. My sloppy, unkept garments, my pudgy visage, the round, freckled, humanish face, the matted red hair, all seemed to confirm her worst fears. Nuna was now the high priestess of Telsuma and beholden to a broken prophecy. A prophecy that I, the conceived of that particular time and place, would be the one to relight the original forest with elvish life and song, and conquer the evildoers. Centuries of intensely orthodox druidic practice, reverence to and from uncountable generations of woodland creatures that had lived and died in anticipation of that coming, my coming. The long-awaited fruition was enabled by the maturity and anointing of the one king, my dead father, Puale, who had been foretold by the seers to be the father of the future queen of all sorts within the vast woods, the one they would call the Restorer. Clearly, that was not me.
"You are quite different than I imagined,"
Nuna said, forcing a smile. "What did you imagine I was?" I asked defiantly. Nuna was taken aback by my fearlessness. That was something she definitely did not expect. To her, I was a street punk, a trashy rogue, and an ignorant, brutish thug. I would never back down, and she knew it.
"I imagined you were my future,"
she answered. Her forced smile descended into an expressionless gaze of hopelessness. "You are your own future. Do you understand?" I was now ready, after years of silent pain, finally able to confront these druidic lunatics and remove their curse upon me, to tear it off me like a leech. My father's prophetic path, the same one they had branded me now with, I despised having to be any part of. I had no intention to fulfill any druidic prophecy. I had to make that clear to her, now and forevermore. I was not having anything to do with them or their religion. Listen, Nuna. I am not your queen, nor will I ever be. Understand? Your king, my father that I never knew, raped my mother, who I barely knew, but loved very much. She was innocent. She didn't want to have anything to do with you, and neither do I.
"Puale,"
she tried to interrupt. He is dead now, and so are his ways. I feel nothing for either of you. Save yourself. Do not look to me for your salvation. Follow me, and you will only find trouble. Understand? I said. Nuna stood up and turned away, hiding the intense emotion she had been trained to suppress.
"What do you plan to do now?"
she asked. Her eyes were focused on the vast forest outside the opened tower window.
"Will you return to your thieving, like a bloodthirsty tick burrowed deep under the ears of men?"
Perhaps I will, but that should be of no concern to you. I will leave this place soon. Do not follow me, I warned.
"Why?"
She turned from the window and faced me.
"Why do you think it is that Karu protects you?"
Because we are friends. I trust him with my life. I was surprised by the question.
"Do you know what it is that he has sworn to protect you from?"
She came closer as she asked. Well, he's kept me far away from you, I retorted. She took on a more aggressive posture, and it was then I noticed she was much more powerful physically than I first sized her up to be. She had a strong build, especially for an elf. I wasn't really sure if I could take her with my hands and fists if I needed to. I had no weapons or components for relevant spells. Nuna's eyes pierced into mine, awaiting her answer.
That is by design, she said.
I became fearful, thinking maybe she could end my friendship with Theb. Perhaps she did have the power to take him from my side through some ancient call of a debt or allegiance. Was he just the paid bagman for this woman? I thought. No, he couldn't be. We'd gone through way too much together, and he was never short of criticism for the druids and their ways. He always claimed they were his clients only. Theb might not return, but he would not betray me. But the answer to her question, that had to do with what they thought I was supposed to be doing by now. Leading them, not just enriching myself, saving the original forest, and destroying the Dark Elves. My voice was lost for a moment until I cleared my throat. The drow, I presume? I said, mired in sarcasm. That is what Theb told me. My father's keepers ordered my safety, and they paid him, at first. But they haven't in over a century. Your money isn't why he's with me, and the drow don't concern me at all. They've destroyed your kind.
Not all of us,
she smirked. I don't care, I retorted. After a tense pause, I won the stare down.
Well, I came to offer you my assistance, but since you clearly are in no need of it, I will go now.
Good. Yes, go, please, I demanded, motioning towards the door. My heart began to beat faster as I was growing increasingly angry and resentful at Nuna's unexpected arrival. If there were males with her, they were probably much more demanding and far less friendly. My list of enemies might be growing by the second, and I had no cover. If I was now a mark, I was a sitting duck for assassination in that tower prison. Nuna turned away from me with a dejected gaze, and then knocked impatiently on the large wooden doors, which barred my escape. As she walked out, I yelled at her passionately. They will only come for those who seek them out. I do not care for you or your kind, Druid. Begone! Leave me be! She left quietly as the heavy wooden doors closed to a ground-shaking slam. A few moments passed, and only when the echoes of my angry cries were finally silenced, and my own breathing was all I could hear, the heavy door once again reopened. 3 elvish spear guards entered. They surrounded Nuna. She looked at me quizzically.
She will refuse the call,
Nuna said, remembering words she had memorized in her youth, centuries ago. She quoted the druidic religious parable, which foretold the Restorer would begin her mission only after her stark refusal to the call. Rather than wait for the guards to handle it, I closed the heavy doors on all of them by myself defiantly, grunting as I pushed, and then slammed it shut on Nuna's stoic face. Perhaps I poured it on a little heavy. I felt compelled to make myself clear, but now, likely all the druids and creatures of the Iadet were aware not only of who I was, but where I was, and I couldn't move. My heart rate quickened. I scrawled a hastily written message. I then demanded a castle messenger provide the note to Theb Karu, insisting he return to Cule Tavet immediately. I then waited for weeks, consumed in paranoia. I screamed out loud for hours at a time, cursing at Theb, praying to any god that would listen, that he or she would take me far away from Cule Tavet as soon as possible. I longed to return to a life of secrecy, anonymity. I could not stand even the notion of fame, for only the dead were truly famous. I continued to wait in that cold little room, until the thoughts of leaping out of the tower and to my death became ever more frequent and inviting. One day, as I sat carelessly, straddling the open window's stone ledge, with only thousands of feet of snowy gorge below, Theb finally returned. He entered my prison quarters with some of his cousins, the same ones who had procured my safety. Theb gave me the stern, "Don't speak" look.
Thank you for your patience, Aermine. Your rest is complete. We shall leave now.
I gathered myself together in earnest. But as soon as Theb's cousins left us alone, I demanded he provide me with as much information as possible on the druids and their religion from the library of Cule Tavet.
Forget the druids. Let us focus on the creation of our own new guild. It's who we are.
Agreed, but I need that information. Nuna came here. You know her? Nuna? He neither confirmed nor denied. Well, she knows who I am, which means they all do. They have me at a considerable disadvantage. I need to know all about them. Theb obliged me, reluctantly. He returned shortly thereafter with a few ancient tomes he had stolen from the library. We left Cule Tavet without ceremony. Theb teleported us away to a hidden station near Tor Bona, where horses, gear, and some money awaited us. We then got right to work, staking out some new spots. We also performed a few paid jobs Theb had arranged. There was no shortage of men with vendettas throughout the Central Plain in those days, so there were plenty of lucrative opportunities for us to pursue. I admit, despite the criminality of it, it was good to be free and working again. Theb had spent months tracking down that Havling backstabber Uro who betrayed us, only to find he was part of a new guild of cutthroats tied to Quell's deadly religious cult, which had now grown very powerful. Uro's new guild consisted of mostly human members, which numbered in the 40s, with several skilled assassins and fighters in their midst. Rather than try to confront them, we did our best to discover where they had staked their claims, which was pretty much everywhere that we used to have a claim, and then some. All the while, I dove into the druidic text because I wanted to carve out a caveat somewhere within the poetry. I wanted to find some kind of lyrical twist I might play on one of their own riddle tales, find a loophole in their own twisted logic, one that would finally free me from their cult and their ill-fated belief in who I was and what I would do for them. But that was proving more difficult than I had anticipated. It was within one tome I discovered my name, Aermine, was of an ancient dialect. It meant promised one. I was determined never to use it publicly thereafter. In the weeks after my awakening from my long rest at Cule Tavet, I learned much had changed in the landscape of humankind's politics. Pel Tavor was dead, and yet his only surviving son, Quell, did not assume his place as military governor of Bishopsgate. Instead, he used his position as high priest of his temple to sweep aside the established aristocrats and nobility, refusing thereafter to pay any tribute to King Owen. Quell then converted the entire city and all of its satellite villages to his ruthless brand of religion. They submitted out of fear of torture and death. The entire Sharmal River Valley had fallen under the grip of his dark theocracy. Quel's religious zeal was reserved solely for his own patron, the demigod of the underworld, Moscow. The once vibrant township of Bishopsgate had become a very dreary place, even by Theb's standards, which said a lot. He reported seeing regular human sacrifices. All the inhabitants were forced to uphold strict adherence to Quel's morbid brand of theological practice. But strangely, there was no challenge to his rule by the men of the north or the east. Theb believed that was due to fear of plague, not Quell. The fertile fields of the Sharmal had become fallow, and many people suffered a strange new illness, the blood cough. Torture and ritual bloodletting were Quell's means of keeping the peace. Considering all this, setting up shop again in Bishop didn't figure to be advantageous, so we looked elsewhere. The Three Kingdoms were undergoing seismic political changes of their own. The lands of King Owen and his brothers had been reduced greatly on all sides. The feudal areas to the north and east and the borderlands to the west had exploded with chaos and dissent. Some of the chaos was because of the growing horde and the inability for the landowners to stop it, but most of the lawlessness was because of the fracturing bonds of humanity caused by years of severe drought and pestilence. There were few large standing armies in the west, and no lord would dare risk his own keep's men to come to the aid of another. This opened the roads to the horde, but also to gangs of highwaymen, robbers, and a propagation of all kinds of strange new religious cults, like Quel's. What was once clandestine had become common practice. I heard a veritable nation of pirates, called the Raiders Coalition, had formed in the Cantam Bay, and as a result, the Three Kingdoms had all of its vital eastern trade routes cut. This compounded the problem for the Western overlords, as their taxes and tariffs reduced drastically as well, spiraling their fragile economies into inevitable collapse. We headed to Tor Bona and the vast wealth of King Owen's castle city by the ocean. It was known as the Jewel of the Crown Bay, and we had done some successful business there before, so we teleported to the shores of the Crown Bay, about 30 miles south of the city. We started there in order to get an idea of the conditions surrounding the city. What we found surprised us greatly. All along the once vibrant Crown Bay Road, in every village we encountered along the shore, there was starvation, vagrancy, and hopelessness. When Owen assumed the throne from his father 4 decades earlier, the One Kingdom became 3. In order to maintain power and consolidate their domains, the kingdom was split into 3 parishes, each ruled by one brother as Earl. Tor Bona, by Owen as king. His younger brothers, Geoffrey, governed Rufus, and his other brother Alan ruled Perriman, to the further east, on the opposite side of the Crown Bay. This arrangement worked well for many years. There was no war between them, and they were able to expand, trade, and grow as one kingdom. But when the horde came to places like Teton and Ebach, Owen's western borderlands were left unprotected, and his people lost faith quickly. This spread to his own ruling families as feudal wars broke out to the north and east. Owen and his earls were increasingly powerless to act, or even threaten any action. The Three Kingdoms were now steeped in steady decline. It was then the giants came. I first heard the name Dan Tinuviel spoken again at a gathering outside of the palace gates of Tor Bona. I learned Dan had become something of a local legend, one of their own who had become famous as a great fighter. I was told he had been knighted into the Order of the Sacred Fire, those fabled bringers of justice based in Voss. I found that hard to believe, but many others agreed that it was so, even after several drinks and truth spells. Most of these people expected Dan to be among the very first to respond to King Owen's call. Church bells rang, gathering the people for a pronouncement from the king.
Hear me, people. Hear me, people. These are the words of His Excellency, King Owen of Tor Bona, Overlord of the Three Kingdoms. There is a growing threat to our people. From out of the hideous western nests, an evil has re-emerged. The Orcish horde.
There were gasps and cries of the already distraught populace. The king's spokesman tried to quiet them down.
Hear me, people. Hear me. Leading this horde is an even greater evil. We have learned. The giants have returned.
Once again, the crowd of hundreds cried in despair. They cried out for salvation. They demanded to know whether the king would or could protect them. I was skeptical. Could Tor Bona itself really be threatened by giants? That seemed highly unlikely to me. The whole of the Sharmal River Valley stood between it and the jagged cliffs beyond the borderlands. An invasion like that, without the aid of ships, would require massive logistical organization. There were so many humans in between.
The king is here. Your king has a plan.
That seemed reassuring.
Owen, our benevolent and strong king, has called on the greatest of fighting men from all over the countryside to gather here at Tor Bona.
That, not so much.
With the aid of our allies to the east, we will strike down this horde as we have done in the ancient times. We will have victory.
Given the broken economy and how bankrupt and unstable the government was at that time, the crowd did not seem very confident either.
People. In addition to our many allies, the greatest fighting men from all over our vast world will come to our aid. His Excellency has promised an ounce of gold for every giant scalp delivered, and a silver piece for each orc or the like. Great wealth is possible for the greatest of the giant killers, whomever they be.
As tempting as that was, I could think of easier ways to earn money, like perhaps stealing the scalp stores from these giant killers, after the fact. Though word of Owen's call did spread quickly throughout the lands, as the scalp of a giant was now one of the greatest of treasures to possess, it would certainly attract the very best fighting men, and other treasure seekers. Though most fighting men, even the best, were not trained to be giant killers. But despite this public call, Dan did not come to Tor Bona. Though many fighting men had arrived as Owen had hoped. Included among them were Galglados of Einderhall, who I later learned was Dan's warrior master. After reassuring the people of Tor Bona, he formed several different posses, all of which rode out into the Sharmal River Valley, never to be seen or heard from again. Ever more calls went out and fewer, lesser men responded. And still, Dan did not come. My curiosity of his whereabouts and well-being overcame me. Despite his best efforts, Theb could not talk me out of abandoning our efforts in Tor Bona. I was determined to head north towards the Castle Voss, the home of the Order of the Sacred Fire. Of course, I wanted to go there to find him, to see what he had grown into. Theb, of course, would have hated that idea and would never agree to go there or seek Dan out, if I actually told him of my intention. So I kept my planning mostly guarded, even with Theb. I had convinced him that in order to get a wider view of the growing carnage to the north and west, we should head out on carriage posing as traders. He agreed to that, but strictly as a means of scouting for a location for our new guild base. On that road to the northeast, each village we passed was ever more desolate than the last. Despite my ruse of intention, it was not lost on Theb that my path was bearing us ever closer to my former home of the Ostrom, and closer to the domain of the druids.
Why do we head north on this common road? It will likely intersect with highwaymen. Or worse, the Horde.
He asked in telling fashion. Curious. To see the old neighborhood, I guess. I retorted smugly. Besides, what are you afraid of? We're equipped, and by that I meant armed, and ready for a fight if any brigands, or even the druids wanted one.
We need allies now, and an organization to support us. We need a separate, steady form of income apart from our own direct enterprise. Without a guild, we'll run out of money, Aermine.
I wasn't as obsessed with money as Theb always seemed to be.
I've learned Dolph might have a small group assembled to the west. They may be willing to form up with us in the Northernlands. We could form a guild there, escape this senseless human war with the Horde.
Dolph? He and the rest of those half-orcs are useless, mindless brutes. Never liked him. Or his brother. There was a long silence as Theb tried to find the right way to ask.
How can we approach these humans? They are justice seekers, and we are thieves, Aermine.
Stop calling me that, I said coldly, and stop fussing about the humans. You know humans. They like elves. They trust us, even when we lie to them. Humans always think we have some kind of special celestial information that they could never otherwise know. Keeps them wanting. Guessing, you know. Theb was growing impatient.
What do you think Dan will tell you, even if he will see you? As I recall, the last thing you told him was he needed to die, by your hand or mine. Certainly, he and his order will take our appearance as a threat. We're walking into a prison.
He knew me much better than I thought he did. Suddenly, a little bird flew out from underneath our carriage. Gossipers! That little bird was probably carrying that gossip with it, deep into the forest. Leave that to me, old friend. I was also uncertain how Dan may have changed in the 7+ years since I last saw him. Humans grew and aged so quickly. This caused them to forget many details along the way. There were thieves with grudges that lasted longer than most human lives. But I was compelled to find Dan because, in truth, I loved him, and I believed he would still trust me. Those 7 years he was with us were the very best years of my life. It was such a happy time. Dan was happy too. He loved the guild probably more than any of us. I felt fairly certain that we were very close to one of my cash drops along this road. That was the main reason I went that way, to gather some stashed coin. I stopped our carriage to rest the horses while I referred to my out-of-date map. Suddenly we saw an armored warhorse approaching down the road. It was galloping fast in our direction, but it had no rider. We slowed it and inspected the warhorse. It was clearly spooked and tired, frothing at the mouth. It was also an expensive breed of horse, adorned with chainmail and plates. This was a fighter steed. There was obviously danger near. Theb and I left the carriage and horses behind bushes, beyond the sight of the road, and continued on foot, retracing the steps of the fighter's horse. About a half-mile up the road, we saw the horse's owner. He was a mass of bloody pulp, covered in battered steel. Whatever had killed him had been very powerful. We could see a small village on the hillside up ahead. There was smoke coming from some of the houses. It was being attacked.
Come, Theb. Let's see what we're up against.
He looked at me with contempt and grasped my wrist before I could move.
This is not the time to start a new career as a hero. The Sacred Order will see right through us. We won't be fooling anyone.
He motioned towards the village ahead.
This could be more than we can handle. And why? Why investigate a poor human village that has already been sacked?
My answer remained unspoken. Theb was bound by oath to protect me. That's all that really mattered between us. The truth was, everywhere I looked, in these pitiful hovels filled with pathetic serfs, I saw my own mother crying for my help. Another mile down that wheel-beaten path of a road was a small farming community. In one of the humble serfs' houses lived a young girl named Mabel. She was where she was told to be, hiding under her bed. She trembled and whimpered in fear because outside of her window she could hear the snorting mass and heavy stomping of a hill giant. Its hideous face peered through her bedroom window. Then it smashed its huge hand through the window, shattering it. Mabel screamed out as the giant's grubby hand poured inside, reaching for her, blindly. First, it grasped her bedding and pulled it past her. She screamed and ran from out of her bedroom, only to hear the giant snort with persistence. She climbed up a ladder to a small attic. There she hid beside the stone chimney. After a moment of silence, she dared hope she may be spared. Suddenly, the fragile roof above her was torn apart. She screamed, and the oafish giant snarled. It grabbed at the girl as it spoke in its own language.
Come, little one. Yes. So perfect for eating.
It grasped her with its powerful fingers and dragged her from the house, screaming. The giant turned to his clansmen.
Tie up the ones that can work. Little ones like this. We will eat.
Another approached, sniffling and giggling as young Mabel screamed, unaware that she was being scoped out for stew. She did not understand the giant's tongue, but I did. There were 3 of them. They held about 6 human captives, including the young girl. I approached and spoke to the giant in his own language, using both a linguistics and a charm incantation. "Hello, O mighty clansman. My, you have captured such a delightful supper. Your chieftain will be so proud," I said innocently, with a broad smile. The giant was surprised by my arrival. Then, as the magic took effect, he smiled back and snorted.
Yes, this little one. She will be delicious.
The 2 other giants approached and were vexed by why the first giant was not stomping my guts out. But I gathered this one was in charge, so I persisted in trying to control him. "Tell your comrades to untie the rest and leave this place. We need to talk," I instructed.
I need to talk to this elf woman.
He turned to say what I commanded, but his comrades were having nothing of it. They pushed him aside and started swatting their clubs at me. They moved aggressively, but too slowly to hit me. I evaded their clumsy blows easily. Theb then approached from behind invisibly, stabbing one in the back of its leg, piercing it with his broadsword in the buttocks. It did not go down like a human victim would. Instead, Theb found himself riding atop its kicking legs like an angry bucking bull, but with twice the size and strength. It thrashed Theb around like a rag doll. As he released his broadsword and fell to the ground, the other pursued him. Just then, the roots and branches of nearby trees popped out of the ground and held the mighty giants in place. I knew right away Nuna was here. She had followed us. But rather than get angry with her, I went to restore my control of the first giant, who was now growing increasingly anxious, seeing his comrades snared in a net of moving roots and tree branches. Theb pulled out his 2 short swords, and with cat-like dexterity, leapt atop the tree limbs that were holding the giants in place. He slit each of their throats. Once lifeless, the giants' bloody bodies no longer required the druids' bindings.
Ah, you see? Your friend should have listened to you. You were so right to command them to leave. Now look, they are killed. You need to get these morsels back to your chieftain.
The giant was on the brink of breaking my spell, but I recaptured his very weak mind.
Yes, Jeek, stars. Dead for not listen to me. I will bring food back for Chief.
The giant turned towards his captured humans and tried to gather them anxiously. Once again, the ground sprouted branches, which captured the giant by the feet, then legs, then wrapped around his neck, tighter and tighter, until his head split off his huge body like the cork from a bottle. Yet instead of sparkling vintage, blood and guts sprayed all over the area. The humans screamed as they witnessed this carnage.
Damn you, Nuna! Why did you do that? And why are you here?
I drew my sword as she revealed herself. She showed her scimitar, but did not draw. As I made each step closer, she stood motionless. I reached out and grabbed her by the throat. Her gray eyes glared with surprise, but she remained still. She did not resist me. I brought my sword to her neck.
Why shouldn't I kill you? I warned you to stay away.
Aermine, do not.
Said Theb.
We need allies. Nuna is helping us.
That? I pointed to the headless pile of a giant, lying in a pool of blood beside the weeping family of human children.
That is not helping.
They are helping us.
Theb motioned to the dozen or so druidic followers who had their bows drawn on me. I released Nuna, but not before sneering my own hostile resentment. I was trying to get valuable information from that carcass, I said, receding my blade in its scabbard.
Whereabouts?
Perhaps, she asked defiantly. Yes, of their steading.
What care you from which hole these giant devils crawled from? It is not their whereabouts you wish to know, but of the lovely human warrior, the giant killer, the one named Dan Tanuvial.
I turned and whipped my short sword out so quickly she was unable to react. However, I stopped the blade again at her neck. The druids once again drew their bows. Nuna glared. After a shocked pause, she breathed out again and spoke.
I know where he is.
Do not speak his name, I threatened. But then I lowered my sword.
It is he you seek, is it not?
Nuna walked over towards the crying children.
Or have you forsaken your thieving ways to become a hero for these human children? Are you now a caregiver by trade?
Nuna smiled and approached the young girl Mabel, still crying in fear, and put her copper-skinned hand gently on her head.
Take your hands off her.
I pushed her back and gathered the girl and her siblings, who now seemed to gravitate to me, clearly the most human-looking of us. Young Mabel leapt into my arms, sobbing. Theb looked at me ever more puzzled.
These aren't going to be your human breeding vessels, Nuna. I told you, go away!
I yelled it aloud again for all the druids to hear. My voice echoed through the trees. Some of the children were badly hurt. Their parents were all dead. As I tried to collect them, I realized there was very little I could do for them, other than hold them. It felt strange to be observed by the wood elves being human, but as I held Mabel, I felt at one with my mother again, who, like this young girl, was scared to death by these woodland freaks.
Aermine, we are not your enemies. Let us help these children, if that is what you wish.
After a few tense minutes, I allowed Nuna to use her healing powers to relieve the pain and clear up the children's many injuries. She then created food for them to eat. Their houses were burned. There was no place for them to go. It was true. I could not be their caretaker, nor offer them a place of refuge, for I was homeless as well. As the barking of approaching wargs brought cause for movement, Nuna later convinced me she would see the human family delivered peacefully to the keep we had passed several miles to the south. Despite this act of kindness, I was still not comfortable being in her presence or with any of her followers. I realized it was high time for a formal understanding between us. It was time to put this whole restorer business to rest. But before I did that, before my final denunciation or cooperation with the druids was staked, I wanted to know one thing. So then, tell me, Nuna, you say you know where Dan is?